It began like any other adventure. 3 friends, a map, and a shared love for the quiet peace of the wilderness. The plan was simple: a weekend hike deep into the forested trails of Black Hollow National Park, a place known for its untouched beauty and near-complete isolation. Liam, always the energetic one, had chosen the trail. Rachel had packed enough snacks to feed a dozen people, and Mark, the quietest of the group, brought along his journal to capture the stillness of nature in words. They arrived just before noon, parked at the edge of the trailhead, and stepped into the green silence with excitement bubbling in their chests. There was no cell service, no sounds of cars or machines, just the crunch of boots on dirt and the occasional call of a distant bird. For hours they hiked peacefully, sharing jokes, pointing out strange mushrooms, and taking photos whenever the sunlight broke through the trees just right. Around late afternoon, they reached a small stream that sparkled like glass. It seemed like the perfect place to camp for the night. They pitched 2 tents side by side, started a small fire, and watched the sun dip below the thick canopy above. Everything felt perfect. But as darkness wrapped around the forest, something shifted. The night felt heavy, the kind of heavy that pressed against the chest and made the air seem thicker. Mark noticed it first, how the usual sounds of the night had disappeared. There were no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, no owl hoots in the distance. Just silence. Deep, unnatural silence. Rachel tried to laugh it off, saying the forest must just be sleeping, but her voice trembled slightly. They sat closer, to the fire, shadows dancing wildly on the trees around them. Sometime past midnight, while the flames had died to glowing embers, Mark woke up with a jolt. A sound had pulled him from sleep. Footsteps, slow, heavy, crunching dry leaves just outside the tent. At first he thought it might be Liam going to pee, but then he heard the breathing. Low and deep. It didn't sound like Liam. It didn't sound like anything familiar. The steps stopped right outside the tent, not moving, just standing, just breathing. Mark held his breath. In the dark, Rachel whispered, asking if anyone else had heard that. Liam, barely audible, whispered back that he had. No one dared move. No one spoke again. They waited, frozen in fear. Then, just as suddenly, the sound began again. The footsteps moved slowly away, disappearing into the woods. They didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally came, the light didn't bring comfort. Something had been out there. And even though it walked away, the feeling that it might return lingered in the still air around them. The hike had only just begun, but already the forest had changed. And they had no idea what was really waiting deeper in the woods. As the morning sun broke through the trees, the forest seemed to stretch and yawn like a giant waking from a long sleep. The 3 friends emerged from their tents, eyes puffy and nerves frayed from the restless night. The fire pit sat cold and forgotten, and their voices stayed low as if speaking too loudly might disturb something still lurking nearby. While packing up the gear, Liam noticed something strange in the soft dirt near the tents. A trail of footprints circled the entire campsite. Bare, long, and unusually wide feet. They didn't match any of theirs. Not one of them had stepped around the tents in the night. Mark crouched down, tracing the print with his fingers. The impressions were deep and fresh, made sometime during the night. They weren't animal tracks. There were no claws, no paws, and no signs of hooves. Just the unmistakable outline of bare human feet. Except these feet looked wrong. Too long. The toes curved oddly, like claws that had once been fingers. Rachel tried to laugh, saying perhaps another hiker had wandered by, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her fear. There had been no other hikers since their arrival, no tents, no distant campfires. Just them, and whatever had walked through their sight while they slept. They continued down the trail with a renewed urgency. each one glancing over their shoulder more often than before. The dense forest closed in tighter, the trees packed together, like tall, silent guards. The sound of birds returned, but it did little to soothe their unease. The air felt too still between the trees. As the hours passed, the group stopped for a break near a fallen log. Mark wandered off a short distance to relieve himself, stepping quietly through a patch of ferns and moss. It was there, between two twisted trees, that something caught his eye. At first, it looked like a shadow, but shadows didn't hold shape like that. Not that still. Not that solid. A tall figure stood about 30 feet away, its body hidden among the trees, motionless like it was carved from stone. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The figure had no color, no clothes, just pale skin that almost glowed in the dim forest. Light. And the face, what little could be seen, was wrong. There were no eyes, only dark hollows where eyes should have been. The mouth was stretched into a smile far too wide, as if the jaw had unhinged. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It only stared, or seemed to. Frozen in fear, Mark took a shaky step back, then turned and rushed back to the others. Liam noticed the panic in his face instantly but said nothing. Rachel asked if everything was okay. Mark hesitated, then simply nodded. Something told him not to speak it aloud. Not yet. But as they packed up and moved on, Liam turned to him, quietly, and whispered, "Did you see it too?" And just like that, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the forest, the group pressed on, determined to find a way out. Each step felt heavier, the trail growing steeper and more overgrown, as if the forest itself was reluctant to let them go. Mark felt the weight of the silence pressing on his chest, and Rachel kept glancing nervously over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something was trailing them. Liam, who usually thrived on the excitement of the wilderness, seemed unusually quiet, his eyes darting from tree to tree. The air felt thicker, colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in a matter of moments. They pushed forward, though none of them spoke much. The night was approaching fast, and they still had no idea where they were. It was when they reached a small clearing, bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun, that Mark noticed something strange again. A figure, tall, thin, standing still at the far end of the clearing. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a tree twisted in a way that made it look like a person. But then it moved, or at least he thought it did. The figure shifted just slightly, as if adjusting its position, but it didn't make a sound. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He turned to Liam and Rachel, but neither of them had noticed yet. His mouth went dry and he raised a hand to point, but no words came out. He felt like his body had frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure remained still, staring at them with an unsettling stillness. There was something wrong about it, something Mark couldn't place. Then he saw it. Its face. It wasn't a face at all. It was a hollow void where eyes should have been. Deep, empty sockets stared back at him, and the mouth was wide, stretched. Too far? Like something that had been carved into a grotesque smile. He couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't respond. The figure seemed to be aware of him, its lack of eyes still managing to pierce through him. It felt as if it could see every part of his soul, every dark thought he'd ever had. He was trapped in its gaze, paralyzed by fear. Then, in a flash, the figure was gone. It didn't move like a normal person would. 1 second it was there, and the next, it was just gone. There wasn't even a rustle of leaves or a snap of twigs. It was as though it had melted into the forest itself, disappearing into the air. Mark blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The clearing felt emptier now, colder. He wanted to speak, to tell Liam and Rachel what he had seen. But when he turned to them, they were already looking at him, their faces pale. Liam asked quietly, "Did you see it too?" Rachel, her voice barely a whisper, added, "The thing in the trees?" Mark nodded, his throat tight. He didn't want to admit it, but it was clear now. None of them were alone in the forest. Something was out there, something that wasn't human, and they were being watched. The hike took a dark turn after that nightmarish encounter. It felt like the forest itself was closing in, its dense foliage pressing tighter with every step. Liam, Rachel, and Mark found themselves trudging through the woods with little direction, the trail now barely visible under the thick growth. The sense of unease that had followed them all day seemed to have grown, like a heavy fog that clung to their skin, to their thoughts. Mark's mind raced. Every rustle in the trees made him jump. Every flicker of movement in his peripheral vision set his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the image of that face, empty eyes and that twisted smile. It haunted him, lurking behind his closed eyelids, following him as they stumbled deeper into the wilderness. By the time nightfall began to settle in, the trio had not found a clear way out. The trail was gone, swallowed by the wilderness. They were lost, and none of them wanted to admit it. Rachel's voice broke the silence, her words laced with a nervous edge. "Maybe we should stop for the night," she suggested. But it was clear she wasn't just talking about resting. Her eyes darted around as if she feared something would reach out from the darkness and drag her away. The idea of staying where they were didn't sit well with any of them, but none of them had a better plan. Liam set up their tents quickly, and they gathered around a small fire, though it felt weak, fragile against the oppressive darkness surrounding them. They sat huddled together, staring into the flames, their minds far from the warmth of the fire. It didn't take long for Mark to notice it again. That feeling, the one that had been crawling under his skin since the moment they first set up camp. The watching, the suffocating presence that lingered in the trees, just beyond their line of sight. He glanced at Liam and Rachel, but neither of them seemed to notice, too wrapped up in their own thoughts. But Mark felt it, a chill running down his spine as he heard it. Soft footsteps, slow, deliberate, just beyond the firelight. It wasn't a wild animal, not this time. The steps were too heavy, too purposeful. He leaned closer to the fire, trying to ignore the fact that his breath had caught in his throat. The flames crackled, but the sound seemed distant, as if the forest itself had swallowed the world around him. Then something strange happened. A voice, soft and indistinct, reached his ears. It was a whisper, too quiet to understand, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was speaking to him. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong. It wasn't human. It was like the voice came from the earth itself, deep and guttural, as if the forest had started to speak. Panic surged through him, and he looked frantically at Liam and Rachel. But they were still staring into the fire, unaware, lost in their own minds. The voice came again, louder this time, a low, rasping sound that sent chills through Mark's bones. His heart hammered in his chest, and for the first time since they started this hike, he felt like he was truly losing his grip on reality. What if they weren't alone out here? What if whatever had been watching them, stalking them, had come closer than they thought? He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. All he could do was listen to the rasping voice that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath him, the sound growing louder, like it was calling his name. The night stretched on, heavy with the feeling of impending doom, and the fire crackled weakly in front of them. The voice had stopped, leaving only the sound of their uneven breathing filling the air. Mark could feel his heart pounding, each beat like a drum in his chest, and he found himself staring into the flames, too terrified to move, too afraid to speak. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in on them. He glanced at Liam and Rachel again, but neither seemed to have noticed the voice. Liam, ever the optimist, tried to break the silence, mumbling something about getting some sleep and starting fresh in the morning. Rachel didn't respond. She only stared at the fire, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear. Mark's mind raced. Every time he tried to convince himself it was all in his head, something shifted in the corner of his vision. A shadow, a flicker, an outline of something moving just outside the circle of firelight. His eyes darted toward the trees, but he saw nothing. Nothing but the oppressive darkness that swallowed everything beyond the reach of the fire. The silence deepened, and Mark felt it again. The sensation of being watched, of something moving, something alive, but not human. He turned his head slowly to look at Rachel, who was sitting rigid, her hand gripped tightly around a flashlight, her eyes fixed on something just beyond him. Without a word, she stood up abruptly, her face drained of color. "We need to leave. Now," she whispered, her voice shaking. Mark followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shape, no figure in the darkness. But Rachel's fear was contagious, and it sent a wave of panic rushing through him. He could hear the distant sounds of something shifting. In the underbrush, heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves, moving closer. Liam stood up too, looking confused but no less frightened. "What is it, Rachel?" he asked, his voice tight with apprehension. But Rachel didn't answer. She just grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him to his feet. "We can't stay here," she said urgently. "It's not safe." But Mark couldn't move. His body was frozen, rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with terror, as he realized that, in that moment, something was standing just at the edge of the firelight, something tall and dark, too tall for any human. The shape didn't move. It just stood there, watching them, its presence so cold that it seemed to drain the warmth from the fire. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to shout, to tell Liam and Rachel to run. But no words came. Instead, he watched, frozen in place as the figure took a slow step forward, the darkness around it seeming to pulse with every movement. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the world tilting, and all he could focus on was the shape in the dark, too tall, too unnatural, its eyes still hollow, its smile still stretched far too wide. And then, just like before, it disappeared, fading into the blackness of the trees. Mark could feel his legs trembling, and it took all his strength to tear his eyes away from the spot where the figure had stood. Rachel pulled at his arm again, her grip tight, urging him to move. Without another word, they stumbled toward the trail, the feeling of something watching them never fading. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they made their way deeper into the unknown. But no matter how far they walked, no matter how fast they moved, the feeling never left. Whatever was out there was still following them, still waiting. And, as the trees closed in, Mark knew they were no longer just lost in the woods. They were being hunted. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the trail narrowing into a jagged path as they stumbled through the thick underbrush. Mark could feel the sweat running down his back, the cold of fear wrapping around him tighter with each step. Every shadow, every whisper of wind, felt like something was lurking just beyond his sight, waiting to pounce. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of civilization, no sounds of distant roads or houses. The night had fallen fully now, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, casting the forest into a deep, suffocating darkness. They could barely make out each other's shapes, their faces pale and wide-eyed in the dim glow of their dying flashlights. Rachel's grip on her flashlight was still tight, her knuckles white, her eyes darting nervously in every direction. Liam, normally the calm one, looked more disoriented with each passing minute. "We should have seen something by now," he muttered, his voice strained. His words hung in the air like a bad omen, and for a moment, Mark didn't know what to say. None of them could explain the emptiness around them, the oppressive silence that seemed to close in tighter with each step they took. Then they heard it, a sound that made Mark's heart stop in his chest. A low, guttural growl. It wasn't like any animal they knew, not like the sounds of the wild they'd heard in the distance earlier. This noise was different, deeper, more unnatural. It came from the trees around them, but it felt like it was coming from within them, from the very ground beneath their feet. Mark froze, his body trembling as the growl seemed to echo in his ears, loud and insistent, getting closer with every passing second. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with dread. Mark nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak. Then, a shape appeared in the dark. It was the same tall, shadowy figure they had seen before, but now it was no longer a vague silhouette. It was a nightmare-given form. The creature's body was tall and thin, far too tall to be human, and the long, spindly arms reached out. Toward them, fingers stretching unnaturally long. Its face remained the same, that twisted, gaping smile with eyes that were voids, endless pits that seemed to draw all light into them. The very air around it seemed to distort, rippling as if reality itself couldn't bear its presence. The creature did not move fast, but it didn't need to. Every step it took left a chilling, empty feeling in its wake, like the world was turning colder, darker. With each moment it came closer. Mark felt his breath catch in his chest as he looked at Rachel and Liam, but neither of them seemed to move, frozen in place as the creature drew nearer. His mind screamed for them to run, but his body betrayed him, locked in place by the sheer terror of what he was seeing. The creature stopped just a few feet away, its gaze cold and predatory. The growl grew louder, rising in pitch until it felt like it was vibrating through his very bones. Then, it spoke. Its voice a low, distorted rasp that sent a jolt of panic through Mark's entire body. The words were unclear, but the intent behind them was unmistakable. This thing was not there to let them leave. It was there to make them part of the forest, part of its twisted, dark world. The terror became unbearable, and Mark's world seemed to tilt once more. Something had to give. Something had to break. They couldn't stay there. They couldn't face this thing any longer. The question was, would they survive the night? Or had they already become part of its nightmare? Panic exploded through Mark's body like a shockwave. The air around him seemed to thicken, suffocating him, as the creature's twisted form towered over them. Its dark eyes burned into him, the voids in its face swallowing all light and warmth. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body felt numb, paralyzed with terror. Rachel stood frozen, eyes wide with dread, her breath coming in shallow, quick gasps, while Liam was equally motionless, his face ashen, his flashlight trembling in his hand. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, the sounds of the forest gone, leaving only the heavy, oppressive silence. The creature made no sudden moves, but the growing tension in the air told Mark that it was getting closer. It could feel their fear, feeding off it, growing stronger. Mark could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, each beat a desperate reminder of the situation they were in. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, to do anything, but his limbs betrayed him. Then, the creature spoke again, its voice, like gravel scraping against metal, a noise that rattled through his bones. "You can't escape," it rasped, the words wrapping around his mind like a vice. The words weren't just a threat. They were a declaration. It was certain. It was confident. And that certainty drove a knife of dread deeper into Mark's chest. Rachel's voice broke the silence, trembling and urgent. "We have to move. Now." Her words shook him from his paralysis. The creature hadn't made a move yet, but Mark knew that its patience was running thin. It was waiting for something. His thoughts scrambled. There had to be a way out. The flashlight in Liam's hand flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows on the ground. It seemed like their only source of light was slowly dying, just like their hope. Then it hit him. An idea, desperate and fleeting, but something. If they could just make it to the trees, maybe they could lose the creature in the thick underbrush. His legs finally obeyed him, moving in shaky steps, but he wasn't alone. Rachel grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the trees, while Liam, still in shock, followed them, stumbling through the underbrush. The creature's growl rumbled through the night, louder and more furious, a warning that it was coming. They ran, the sounds of their own frantic footsteps mingling with the heavy, unnatural growl of the creature behind them. Mark's breath burned in his chest, but he didn't dare stop. Every tree they passed felt like a barricade between them and the nightmare chasing them. The forest, once a source of beauty and adventure, had become a labyrinth, a prison. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to trap them. Mark glanced back, seeing the creature now gaining on them. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its mouth opened wider with each step, as if it were savoring the hunt. The panic surged again, a wild, desperate need to survive. Rachel screamed as something caught her foot, pulling her down, but Mark didn't stop. He grabbed her hand, pulling her up, his mind blurring with terror and determination. The creature was close, too close. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't hide from it. Then, out of nowhere, the forest seemed to shift. The growl stopped. The air cleared, and the sounds of the chase faded into an eerie stillness. Mark's heart pounded in his ears as he glanced around, disoriented. The creature had disappeared, vanished like it had never been there at all. They were no longer in the same forest. The path had changed, the trees different, the night less oppressive. They were still lost, but the nightmare was gone. They had escaped. For now. Mark didn't know how. He didn't know why. But as they stood there, breathless and terrified, he knew one thing for sure. They had survived. For now.